Streaming. I think we're live. I think it's Jive Talk, and I think we're going to be discussing a really exciting new paper that has changed the field of Germanic studies forever, with all kinds of fascinating findings, some of which have been confirming what's been found in earlier papers, and some of which are completely new. I don't know if I'm even going to have time to go over everything that has been found in this paper, or it's been proposed. It's only the preprint, but yeah, there's so much to go over in just 1 hour. But I've got a lot to say, and I'm really excited. I think it's a great paper. There's something I disagree with. It's the main actual thesis they're presenting about the very origin of I1, but it's still a really interesting thesis, and it could be right. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just not sure about it. But yeah, I'm going to go over exactly what they're saying about the very origins of Germanic people and the Germanic languages, and also what they say about the later dispersals of Germanic in the migration era, before the migration era, and in the Viking era, and how that actually confirms what contemporary historians were saying about the migration era and the post-Roman Germanic migrations, and basically how historians for the last 1,000 years have mostly been right about the Germanic peoples and their migrations and origins. And the 20th century people have been wrong, which is great. But yeah, I have also time at the end. We'll go over some of your super chats. I will of course read super chats, as I always do. So yeah, and I've not probably got time for all the chats. Everyone, I'm streaming on X. Good day for the people down under I can see someone in X saying good day. I don't know what time it is down under, but good to see some Aussies here. And also streaming on Jive Talk on YouTube. Now, the name of the paper is Steppe Ancestry in Western Eurasia and the Spread of Germanic Languages. And the first named author on the paper is Hugh McColl. So I refer to it as McColl and Colleagues 2024, thenceforward. How are we doing? No need for me to be here. Right. I've got my green screen behind me so you can see what I've got here. And yeah, I'll be putting up some useful bits and bobs. Get this one out the way. OBS, you annoying software. You have to have this thing open, apparently. Right. The paper, I did write up on my blog a problem with the main thesis. To try and go over it quickly, the paper is suggesting the first part I'm going to talk about is the corded Ware culture influences on Germanic and the history of genetics of Scandinavia, and how it relates to the I1 haplogroup. And then after that, I'll talk about the Iron Age South Scandinavian genetic signal and how this is integral to understanding the migrations of Germanic people in the migration era. So basically, it's identifying early on, around 2,800 years ago, the first Indo-European people arrive in Scandinavia. And they are a variant of the corded Ware culture called the battle axe culture by archaeologists. And using IBD sharing, we see that the what have I done? That the basically you can see the general correspondences of the archaeological cultures associated with Yamnaya, corded Ware, and Bellbeaker, marked here in blue, green, and muddish green. Now, IBD sharing is for usually in like genetic studies. They're like looking at the very clearly delineated like root races of the Europeans, the hunter-gatherers, Western hunter-gatherers, the Yamna or Western steppe herders, and the related peoples like Bellbeaker and corded Ware, and the early European farmers. And you can tell easily those apart because they're quite distinct populations. But then when you go into later Bronze Age and Iron Age, it gets a bit more complicated because everyone in Europe by then is a mixture of those three populations. So when you're trying to differentiate the populations, geneticists have been looking at haplogroups, which is one way to sort of see things, and another is just looking at the varying amount of admixture of those ancient populations to try and distinguish populations. But that's not a foolproof method, because some different populations can have very similar amounts of those different admixture levels. So that doesn't help. So the paper here is relying on a method called IBD sharing. And some interesting thing from their model, or their mixture modeling, you can see the colored areas of the map here refer to the different areas of the archaeological culture of the bell beaker, and the little dots are the actual samples. And you can see clearly, okay, the blue dot round bits are found in the areas where the archaeological cultures are. So the genetic group recognized by IBD sharing for bell beaker people categorizes all these blue circles, these skeletons in that thing, and those correspond exactly to where the bell beaker culture archaeologically is identified. Pots are people, despite what progressive archaeologists and people have been trying to push in recent decades. There are some crossover areas here in Central Europe, of course, where the corded ware and the Yamnai and the bell beaker all sort of mixed together. But these three populations of the Bronze Age Europe, Yamnai, corded ware, and bell beaker, are the three vectors for Indo-European cultures everywhere in the world today. There are no Indo-European cultures that don't descend from one of those three in the world now. There were some ancient ones that did, but let's not go into that now. That's complicated. It's not to do with Germanic. But here's what's cool. If you go back, irritating, it's gone. If you go to this lower one, so here, this was the Bronze Age, 5,000 years. They see another thing about the paper I don't like is that they refuse to use BC or even BCE. They use BP before present, so you have to try and do little maths in your head every time to figure out what date they're talking about. So 5,000 years before present, 4,000 BC, 3,000 BC, and here linguistic borders in the Germanic, so like about 4,000 years ago, 1900 years before present, about 2,000 years ago, at the time of, the Roman Empire, the Celtic and the Germanic regions, thousands of years after like the early Indo-Europeans, but they still correspond pretty closely to what they had been earlier. So like the Germanic areas are generally former corded ware areas, and the Celtic areas are former bell beaker areas. Now, of course, it's not 100%, but it's very, very similar, considering that like this is a long time later, different languages, different cultures, different archaeological groups. But there has been a very interesting continuation of that, which is why I guess to begin with in the title, and I'm beginning the stream, we're talking a little bit about the Indo-European period of the Bronze Age before going into the relevant parts of history where we can talk about Germanic people, because certainly you can't talk about Germanic people existing at the time of corded ware. A background on Germanic languages. All the Germanic languages now descend from a language called Proto-Germanic, which started to diversify into different Germanic languages sometime around 500 BC. Prior to that, in the 500 odd years prior to that, there's a period, and by the way, Proto-Germanic is reconstructed. We have early languages like Germanic languages like Proto-Norse and some runic inscriptions that are very close to Proto-Germanic and basically almost Proto-Germanic. But yeah, it's still a reconstructed language, but it's reconstructed very reliably because we have so many different Germanic language groups, like the East Germanic, the West Germanic languages, and the North Germanic languages. So you can tell quite a lot about what that language was like 2,000 years ago when people spoke Proto-Germanic. But before that, Paleo-Germanic was spoken. And Paleo-Germanic, in the first millennium BC, between like 1000 BC and 500 BC, that's when a lot of the interesting stuff happened in Germanic, that it took on loan words from Celtic, but also gave loan words into Finnish. So that tells us that the Germanic people in that time had contacts with the Celts in Germany to the south and with the Finnic people probably in Finland as well. which is tantalizing information. But this paper is going into what was even like before then. So before Paleo-Germanic, the Germanic branch of the Indo-European languages had already broken off, probably in the corded Ware period. But it wouldn't have been a recognizable Germanic sounding, but it was, ancestral to all Germanic languages, because it was ancestral to Paleo-Germanic. And because, although the first Indo-Europeans come into Scandinavia around 2800 BC, there are subsequent migrations of Indo-European peoples all through the Bronze Age, like in the Bell Beaker related peoples come in, the single grave culture comes in from the south in the Nordic Bronze Age. And the Nordic Bronze Age, by the time of the Nordic Bronze Age, like say 1600 BC, that kind of period, you're actually seeing a different landscape from what was the original Indo-European languages. So the original, the Indo-European language speakers of Scandinavia, because all the original Indo-European language speakers of Scandinavia who came from the corded Ware cultures, battle axe variant, and all of them had R1A, pretty much haplogroup. But then by the time you got to the Nordic Bronze Age, there's a pretty even split of R1A from the first Indo-Europeans in Scandinavia, R1B brought in by Southerners, of Bell Beaker related Southerners, and I1, the origin of which is still mysterious and disputed. And that is going to be a crucial part of this stream we have to discuss, because this paper suggests that the introduction of I1 was the introduction of the Germanic branch of the Indo-European languages. And that I1 is the primary paternal lineage associated with its introduction to Scandinavia. The question is, where does I1 come? They have a novel and never before proposed theory for where I1 comes from. I dispute it, but it's very interesting, and we'll talk about that today. But let's just go about, discuss the association they have using the IBD sharing method of the I1 lineage with a newly identified group of Scandinavians called the East Scandinavian cluster, according to their model. Now, the East Scandinavian cluster, here we go. The clustering of Eastern, Northern, and Western Scandinavian subclusters, I'll just make it a bit smaller so my head's not in the way anymore, within the corded Ware North cluster, I mean in battle axe people, and the Steppe Ancestry model as corded Ware East, points to a shared history as part of the corded Ware expansions. However, the first detection of Eastern Scandinavians, this new group they're referring to, East Scandinavians, which basically means somewhere around Sweden, talking about round Lake Malar, or Mälaren, 800 years after the corded Ware people got to Scandinavia. So you're talking about 4,000 years ago. So the corded Ware people got there 4,800 years ago to Scandinavia. And 800 years later, this new group, certainly corded Ware, another corded Ware group, distinct from, according to IBD sharing method, other corded Ware people in Scandinavia. And they are distinct because they have the presence of a hunter-gatherer ancestry which they claim is not local to Scandinavia, pointing to an additional late arrival into Scandinavia by the ancestors of the Eastern Scandinavians. Now, that's quite controversial. So, yeah, the first major steps. So, some people say that Bell Beaker culture to Jutland and Norway around 2200 BC is the moment when this language group was introduced. That was probably what I thought. To be honest, Germanic languages coming in with the Bell Beaker related people who entered Jutland and Norway around 2200 BC and brought R1b with them. And it's around that time that you start to see I1 appear as well. I still kind of think that's what's happened. But in contrast with the older hypotheses, an East Scandinavian population, which is not detected for another 400 to 800 years, is revealed here as an alternative vector for the introduction of Germanic, allowing for the proposition of a revised model. And they're saying, like, while the other corded Ware people have Western hunter-gatherer ancestry, they're caught locally, probably, the Eastern Scandinavians are modeled with Lithuanian or Latvian hunter-gatherer ancestry, indicative of the late Neolithic cross-Baltic migration into Scandinavia. No such migration has, to our knowledge, been identified in the archaeological record. It hasn't, as far as I know, either. So this is a problem because what they're saying here is that somehow you got the corded ware people coming in with R1A, and you can see in this IBD clustering map, the initial people R1A, all the Norwegians samples have R1A, all the Norwegian battle axe culture samples have R1A. Everyone had R1A in the early Indo-European Scandinavia. And then later you've got Bell-Beaker related people bringing R1B in, and then you also see some I1. And then they're saying later on, you get this influence of what they call East Scandinavians, and they all have I1, which is my haplogroup. And they reckon this is Germanic. And I do believe they're right to say it's Germanic. But what I don't understand is why they want to say it's from the East and not just something that came in with the Bell-Beaker related people. I do beg your pardon. Let me turn this off. It's rude to call me during work here. So this population is alleged to have formed around 2000 BC. The author suggests a possible migration across the Baltic Sea to explain this East Scandi group, despite there being no evidence for it in the archaeological record. And they point out that the timing coincides with the introduction of a new late Neolithic sheep breed to Scandinavia. But sheep are not likely to have been brought over by Lithuanian hunter-gatherers by boat across the Baltic, which is an enormous crossing, by the way. And also you get a new burial rite of gallery graves in South Sweden, with the kind of Shivak thing with kist burials or whatever. But that's in the south of Sweden. So that's also both of those things don't look like they're coming from the east from Baltic. They both look like they're coming from the south. New house type and the first durative bronze networks. Well, the networks often trading with Britain for tin to the west. So again, that doesn't look like something to do with Lithuanians or Latvian hunter-gatherers at all. So it's not proof of anything. As well as the end of the east-west divide in Scandinavia, yet none of these arrivals, they necessarily come across the Baltic Sea. This is my words now. So the feasibility of a mass migration of a people across the Baltic at this period in history is questionable. They're suggesting it, but they're not suggesting that they've proven it because they haven't even got any proof to offer. Sea crossings from the south are far more plausible because you just hop over the islands. I mean, now it's even a bridge. You can drive straight over from Copenhagen to Sweden. It's not that far. Whereas the Baltic, I've crossed even from Stockholm to Helsinki by ferry via Åland, and it's an overnight crossing. It's all night. It's hours and hours and hours. It's not an easy crossing. It's whereas the crossing from Denmark to Sweden is like nothing. I mean, you could probably even walk it in certain cold winters. Their figure 4.A, which is on screen now, shows the geographical distribution of individual samples belonging to the three Scandinavian clusters they identified existing prior to 800 BC, after which they will merge together. I'll get into that merging later. So they say there's a strong correspondence between the clusters and specific haplogroups as follows. One, the early Scandinavian, including the oldest Swedish battle axe culture, R1A. Then the southern Scandinavian cluster, restricted to Denmark and the southern tip of Sweden, which is mostly with R1B and some I1. And then a later eastern Scandinavian cluster spread across Sweden, overlapping with that of the southern Scandinavian cluster, which is dominated by I1. And the third map of the so-called Eastern Scandi group shows mainly samples from the south, and the I1 distribution is not demonstrated to have come from the east. In fact, it appears from the data to have come from the south, in my opinion. We already have an I1 sample, or a related to I1 sample, close to it, from North Germany dating to 3300 BC, which is older than these samples. So by tying this newly identified group to the I1 haplogroup, they have brought into question their own claim that it has a Baltic origin. And that will only really be settled by the discovery of an I1 sample in a corded ware context from that period after 2800 BC when they got there, the battle axe people, and before it became a dominant haplogroup in the Nordic Bronze Age. There's this big period where it's not sampled and I1 is mysteriously just pops up, that's why we don't really know yet. And they admit that it's necessary to confirm the proposed Bronze Age source of the East Scandinavians along the Baltic coast, because there is no known possible source in the Baltic that it could be. And my own view is that the elevated Eastern hunter-gatherer ancestry that they found that distinguishes this East Scandinavian group of corded ware people from the other corded ware people in Scandinavia may incorrectly have been identified as Latvian in origin merely due to a lack of samples from local hunter-gatherer populations. So there may be a local hunter-gatherer population which would more clearly fit in their model as the source of this EHG. It's just that their model is finding that Latvian and Lithuanian hunter-gatherers are closer fit than local hunter-gatherers because there aren't that many samples, and the sample bias has led to this mismatch. That's what I consider to be more likely than that this language family migrates over from the Baltic because, one, archaeologically no evidence. Two, it's implausible, it's a very long way, not something hunter-gatherers is likely to do. Three, the corded ware people in the Baltic aren't actually, I don't think they got that elevated levels of EHG that would make them like a suitable source population here. And also the Baltic languages aren't really that close to Germanic, which is there's also the Kentum Sartum distinction, Germanic's not the same, even if you even believe in Kentum Sartum having any currency anymore, because some people don't, and I'm not a linguist so I can't comment on it, but they're quite distinct groups of Indo-European languages, so it just doesn't work for me. A more clear explanation would just be that they haven't got a decent they haven't got sufficient samples from local Scandinavian hunter-gatherers to be able to identify the elevated EHG source in Eastern Scandinavians. However, it's very exciting that they identify this group of East Scandinavians as being important, because everything about them that they say which follows the formation of this group is very, very relevant and changes everything we understand about the way Germanic languages developed. So, yeah. So they say this, I'll go into as well the Southern Scandinavian thing later, but I don't want to go. So I'm more convinced by what they talk about what happens later, Paleo-Germanic language in the period between 1050 BC and 500 BC, when it borrowed from Celtic and Finnic, from Celtic and into Finnic. And they show that after 2000 BC, the East Scandi group expanded into Denmark and Norway, that's why, because of that, it's dominant, and it's the one Scandinavian of the three groups of South Scandis, West Scandis, and East Scandis. East is the one that's spread everywhere and is ancestral to all the Germanic speakers, and so that's the one that's obviously the real introducer of Germanic language group, family, branch, not the other South Scandis or West Scandis. So in that case, the I1 carriers of East Scandi, because the East Scandi IBD cluster is associated with I1, and the East Scandi one is the one that it is the one that's ancestral to all Germanic, so it's reasonable for them to make this conclusion, I think. A mixing of the East Scandis with the South Scandis is dated between 1700 BC and 1400 BC, and that spans both Nordic Bronze Age period 1 and 2, directly preceding the construction of the Kivik tomb, which I did a video all about, you should watch, to learn about what we learn about. This is the beginning of the Germanic culture in this period, around 1400 BC, where you've got chariots and lots of very Indo-European symbols of solar symbols and horses and stuff like this. And the mixing event formed a new group that they call in this paper Iron Age South Scandinavians. By the Iron Age, Jutland can be entirely modelled with the admixed Danish Bronze Age source, while Iron Age Norway and Danish islands have also additional East Scandinavian admixture on top of the initial East Scandinavian stuff they got from the first Bronze Age mixing event. So the East Scandinavian dominate in multiple periods of the Bronze Age, keep coming in waves out into other parts of the Nordic Germanic world. So it's pretty clear cut that they're the big shots of the Scandinavian world, the East Scandis, from around Lake Mälar. And actually that's what happens in the historical period as well. Sweden is the region of Scandinavia that dominated all the others. It still is by far the most populous part of the Nordic countries, and the region of Sweden, where everyone most lives and is the richest, and is, you know, the region around Lake Mälar still, which is where Stockholm is. So it makes sense. It's a good area for farming. It's a good area for sea trade. It's a good area. It's just generally a good part of Scandinavia to live and for people to flourish. So I completely believe that, and I would say that the origins of Germanic probably do come from around Lake Mälar somewhere. East Scand and this East Scandi group carrying the I1 haplogroup are going to be the vector of it. And they say this admixed Iron Age Southern Scandinavian group is central to understanding the Germanic dispersals, and I agree with that too. And we can trace the spread of the Iron Age South Scandinavian ancestry, which is the mixture of the Bronze Age South Scandinavian and Bronze Age East Scandinavian, into Germany, Britain, and the Netherlands during the migration era, as well as to Italy with the Langobards. We'll get into that later. But so 15 of the 16 Bronze Age samples in Norway are R1A, and 1 is I1. So there is a little bit of I1 in Norway even then as well. That's worth pointing out. And it does look like the original Germanic were rich in I1. I'm just going to say that it's very plausible now that that's the case. So I1 reconsidered on this basis. Here's my problems. Okay, so I spoke to Sturla Illenborg about this, and he reckons, as you can see in this map, that it makes sense that it could be even from Finland that they crossed over, because he's saying, look, there's quite actually, you can see in this map here that there's quite a high proportion of I1 in modern day Ostrobothnia in Western Finland. But I don't agree with him. I don't think it comes from Western Finland. I don't think Germanic languages came from Western Finland, because that I1 in there is almost definitely the result of, firstly, Viking Age incursions into Finland, because Vikings did settle in Western Finland 1,000 years ago or more. And also more recently, this was a part of Sweden's empire in the golden age of Swedish history. And that's why they speak Swedish in parts of Western Finland. So I really wouldn't say that it could be reliably said to be the origin of I1 based on that. So I don't agree with him there, unless I see evidence of more evidence for its dispersal and spread from Finland in the Bronze Age. Now, I'm going to defend my own position on I1's dispersal first. So 100 ancient genomes show repeated population turnovers in Neolithic Denmark by Alan Toft et al., which was also released this year, although the preprint came out ages ago. And that paper found that in late Dagger period from 2000 BC, a distinct cluster of Scandinavians with I1 haplogroup spread, they allege, from the south to the north. So they were focusing mainly on Denmark. So yeah, it looks like from their perspective, I1 entered Denmark from Sweden. And perhaps in later Bronze Age, that's true to some extent. But they're thinking of these kiss burials like Kivik being like this northern thing coming down Scandinavia into the south. But they didn't find any decent evidence for that, like for its its dispersal from the north. And sort of I1 becomes a dominant lineage, according to them, associated with these stone-kissed burials. And this race, after it comes in, is the same as the Vikings 3,000 years later. They say this was the formation of the Germanic people when the I1's introduced. And that's pretty much what this paper's finding. And I'm thinking that's true. I agree with that. But and it's consistent with the new paper about I1 East Scandinavians coming to the south, Scandinavia from the east. Similar thing they're saying. The two papers are sort of in sync. But the Alan Toft paper provides no clear evidence of the northern origin of I1 carriers, and the new paper provides no evidence of this cross-Baltic thing. So I'm still not sure about what they're saying. I don't think you should be sure about it. So there's three main theories right now for I1's origins. I'll go over them all and give them all a fair shake, so you can make your own mind up on what you think's right. Now, there's a Neolithic skeleton from Germany's TBK or funnel beaker culture, and that's been found with a paternal haplogroup which is very closely related to the Nordic Bronze Age I1, and it has 52 out of the 62 mutations of the I1 that I have, or that the Bronze Age Scandinavians have. Like when we talk about I1 today, everyone who's got I1 today, me included, is the same ones that the Viking had and the Nordic Bronze Age kings had. There's just one group of I1. But before the Nordic Bronze Age, there must have been other ones, other groups. And this one is a divergent one. It's divergent, but it's not very divergent. So it belongs to a haplogroup IL840. And this sample is called OST003, Ost, which means cheese in Swedish. No, I don't think that's on purpose. It dates to 3000. And we talk about another cheddar man. Is this Sweden's cheddar man? It dates to 3200 to 3000 BC. So it's before corded ware in Scandinavia. And it's surprisingly, despite it being buried in a Neolithic farmer context, he also had some hunter-gatherer tools, and his ancestry was mostly WHG. So he's WHG racially, for the most part. And he seems to have been some kind of like semi-integrated TBK person, like a hunter-gatherer who was integrated into the TBK lifestyle, had some farmer ancestry, and was probably farming, but he was still living hunter-gatherer lifestyle, and he was mainly racially of hunter-gatherer ancestry. He comes from the Orsdorf Tannenwerder burial site, a special group within Neolithic northern Germany. The cemetery contained 26 individuals, and the entire burial is within a Neolithic context of earthen flat burials. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So here's the skeleton I'm talking about. That's what he looked like. Robust, wide cheekbones, excellent teeth. This is typical Western hunter-gatherer. And here is a reconstruction by the Beaker lady of what he might have looked like. So I think that because of this, it looks like Western hunter-gatherers related to this guy had the ancestral clade of I1 that became the one in the Germanic, and we just haven't sampled it yet. Because this one, he does not have the haplogroup ancestral to Germanic I1. He doesn't have that. So his existence is not proof of I1 belonging to WHG, but because it's such a closely related clade, I think it's very likely that we're going to look for I1 in Western hunter-gatherers in Germany. That's my opinion. But I'm not saying that his existence is proof of that. I'm saying it's suggestive of that. So he's from before the most recent common ancestor of I1, either at a closely related branch or the closest thing to an ancestral carrier we have so far. There's another sample, which is a Scandinavian hunter-gatherer called SF11. And SF11 also has a distant relative of I1, even more distant from the Germanic I1 than the one this WHG carries. And some people think that because of SF11, therefore that I1 must be a native Scandinavian haplogroup from Scandinavian hunter-gatherers, which is also a possibility. However, if this guy from Germany isn't proof of German hunter-gatherer origin for I1, then the Scandinavian hunter-gatherer is even less useful as evidence because his subclade is even more distant from modern I1. So, but both of them are suggestive of a native I1. These are the two closest we can get to ancient, to prehistoric, to like Neolithic I1 that we've got, and one's in Scandinavia and one's in Germany. None of them in the Baltic, none of them in Lithuania or Latvia. So I'm going to go over them now. So theory one, my preferred theory, southern origin for two reasons. Firstly, majority of early I1 samples are all in southern Scandinavia, as I showed. All in the Bronze Age, like actual, ancestral to Germanic ones are in southern Scandinavia, not anywhere else, not northern Scandinavia. And secondly, you've got OST003, this good-looking dude who doesn't have the ancestral I1, but does show that a related subclade is in Germany, and that it was preserved among Neolithic farmers in Germany. And those Neolithic farmers in Germany are known to have had genetic input on Scandinavians. So that, to me, is a big hint. And it would have entered Scandinavia from Germany in the Bronze Age, if I'm right. That's my favorite theory. Not proven yet. Second theory is that it comes from native Scandinavian hunter-gatherers. but there's even less proof of that. And the third is a new theory in this paper by McColl and colleagues, which instead posits an Eastern origin that's not based on any haplogroup evidence, but on the strontium isotope analysis of some early samples, which fall into this East Scandinavian IBD sharing cluster that they've identified. And since they have this cluster is associated with the I1 haplogroup, and their strontium analysis indicates that they probably grew up in eastern, central, or northern Sweden. So therefore, they're calling it the Eastern Scandinavian cluster instead of the South Scandinavian cluster, which perhaps they should be calling. But who knows? Here again, the evidence is inconclusive, especially as there is not enough data to prove where these I1 carriers came from, really, at this stage. And proposing a cross-Baltic route, I think, just does not have any archaeological merit. Like, there's no evidence for anything like that kind of cross-Baltic trade at that period in history. Although there is plenty of like Baltic presence in Gotland later on, very much so. In Bronze Age Gotland, there definitely was a Baltic presence. So it's all three of them could be true. I'm not saying any of them are wrong. But one of them is true. Well, maybe it could be none of them are true. But any three of them could be true, or all three of them could be wrong, and something else could be true. But I don't think all three of them are wrong. I think that one of them is right, and I think that the most likely is the first one, not the third one that the paper proposes. Let me know in the comments which one you think is most likely. The oldest I1 samples have a very southern Scandinavian distribution now, and that's probably also because that's where most of the samples come from. And there are no samples from East Sweden where the Allentoft paper claims I1 cluster originates, based on strontium and isotope ratio analysis. Or is it the McColl papers claiming? But anyway, at this stage, no one can claim the matter settled. So don't let anyone say we know for sure now, because we don't know for sure yet. This paper does not prove for sure what the origin of I1 is. It just proves very well that these I1 carrying so-called East Scandinavian cluster is the most likely vector of Germanic language branch over the Bronze Age and into the Nordic Bronze Age. Now, before I go over some of the other points about what happened in the migration era and after the Bronze Age, I'll just go through some of the comments that I've got from you. What's going on here? This doesn't look good. Am I not streaming anymore? I hope you can all see me still. People are still commenting, I guess, so it's all good. But I can't see any of the super chats. I wrote down a couple earlier, so I'll thank you for everyone who's given super chats. Grimwolf gave a £10 donation. He said, Heimdall Rig gave his seed to the three classes of man, Odin, Vili, and Vi, breathed spirit and body into the first Germanic people, Ask and Embla. We are the children of the gods. Is that not whence we came? Good point. For pagans listening, and those who are listening and just want to know about DNA, Grimwolf was bringing up like the theological origin myths of the Germanic people. And he's saying he's concerned that this data might conflict with the religious view. Actually, he's mixing up some different myths there. So you got three myths. You got the Rigsula myth, in which Rig, who's probably the god Heimdall, distinguished mankind. He didn't give birth to mankind, but he fathered the three castes of men to differentiate different types of man. And then you got in Völuspor, we got the myth with Ask and Embla, the first man and woman, who are pieces of wood on the beach given life by Odin, Luther, and Hönir. And then there's another version, in the Prose Edda, where Odin and his brothers Vili and Vi, who may be Luther and Hönir by other names, use Ymir to fashion the world, kill Ymir and first sacrifice, fashion the world. And then also there's a fourth thing where Tacitus mentions 2,000 years ago, that the Germanic people descend from the god Twisto via another god Manus, and Manus birthed 3 different tribes of Germanic people: the Ingveones, Irminones, and Istveones, and they're probably those are probably founded by 3 gods. Istvi, don't know about that god. Ingvi, which is Ingvi Freyr, who's a well-attested god, and Irmin, who's probably Odin. So all these different Germanic origin myths have ascribe a divine origin to the Germanic peoples in a different way. I like that the Tacitus myth has 3 different branches as like divine origin, in which case you could say that the 3 haplogroups of the Germanic people, I1, R1b, and R1a, are the 3 different ones. And one of the Ynglinga dynasty, which is they claim descent from the god Ing, king of the Ynglinga dynasty, found in a burial in Estonia recently, is shown to have I1 haplogroup. In that case, the Ing would be I1, if you want to believe a divine origin. But the problem is, all 3 of the groups are supposed to all descend from Manus, so they should all have the same haplogroup if you apply science to mythology. But there's a problem here because profane science and metaphysics don't go together perfectly. But we know that all 3 haplogroups are associated with the Germanic people, but that I1 was the original one. So it's a special one for Germanic people in that sense, but they're all there from the very beginning of Germanic languages, really. They're all in Scandinavia in the Bronze Age. But thank you for your donation, Grimwolf. Liquid Oxygen says, would you be willing to review the archaeological details in concert with the genetics? Well, I have been trying to do that as I go along. I hope it's been sufficient. The understanding always evolving, and I think a review of the various cultural interactions, developments, such as Funnelbeaker, Battle Axe culture, Single Grave, Jarstorf, could be useful. I'll try and go over the archaeological cultures as we go, but it's only 1 hour, so it's really not I'm just trying to match the genetics for the people who aren't familiar, because each one would require an explanation and it would just go well over an hour. The key things I'm curious for refreshers are the alleged founding of Battle Axe culture by corded ware migrants. Well, that's not really alleged, it's very well documented, who crossed the Baltic in boats. Oh, there's a misunderstanding there. He's not saying all Battle Axe culture comes from the Baltic. It's just saying that this later Eastern Scandinavian variant of corded ware Battle Axe culture was across Baltic. That's it's not claiming that the West and South Scandis are cross Baltic migrants. The relationship of Single Grave to BBC and Scandi cultures, yes. Well, I kind of covered that because that's already the Belbeca culture related migrants carrying R1b up from the south coming in the Bronze Age. I covered that. And the lack of 1-1 continuity between Bronze Age Battle Axe culture and Nordic Bronze Age. That's also true because the early Battle Axe culture is all R1a, and the Nordic Bronze Age is more diverse in its lineages, and also the autosomal makeup of Scandinavians in the Nordic Bronze Age is more southern shifted. So there's influence from the continent coming in from Germany. And the bifurcation of Nordic Bronze Age into Jarstorf and the Nordic Iron Age. Well, rather than talk about that archaeologically, I think we'll just stick to what the genetic paper is talking about, because it does discuss how post-Nordic Bronze Age the genetics changed, and it shows us a lot about what would have happened to give birth to Jarstorf culture. I hope we can get into some of that. Irrational Recreation asks, I think that using high-level Y haplogroups can in general be misleading because the error bars on their age estimates are quite broad and they could predate the period in question by 1,000 odd years. I know this paper seems to be using IDF29, using I1 as a shorthand for I1a, no big deal, but it might well be picking up a correlation with a downstream SNP that is more relevant, like IL22. They could be separated by 500 years, which is significant. Perhaps drilling down into the datasets will reveal what SNPs were tested for, but that's for someone with time on their hands. Secondly, a genetic signal for the Paleo-Germanic group should be detectable in Finland. No? I think it's understood and confirmed by this recent preprint that 3 of the 4 main Y haplogroups in Finland, N1A1, I1A, and R1A all have an east-west cline consistent with migration from the west and east. They're not sure about R1B in that paper, which they say could be a sample size issue. I believe that autosomal admixtures are also east to west. Paleo-Germanic had a very significant influence on what was to become Finnish, and I would expect this to be driven by a genetically distinct population, with a north-south cline rather than east-west. Is that reasonable? Has it been eradicated in the present-day population by subsequent migrations, and so leaving us with only a hope for future Finnish ADNA samples for proof? Could it be that the focus on the high-level YHG haplogroup is masking something downstream of I1A? Whew. I think that's going to go over the heads of a lot of my viewers. But yeah, he's making asking some interesting questions that I don't think I've got time to answer or able to answer off the bat. The introduction of the influence of Paleo-Germanic on Finnish is something that happens, as I said earlier, after 1000 BC. So it's not to do with this East Germanic cluster, because that didn't really that had already happened along 1,000 years earlier. So but more sampling is always needed. It's funny because Scandinavia is a not very populous area of the world, and it's very well sampled for ancient samples, ancient DNA, far more than other parts of the world. So, but even so, it's still there are unanswered questions. But I mean, we're learning a lot about the origins of Germanic people now. Let's go on with the journey of discussion here. I can see more. I can see now. Okay. Reinhard von Lohengrin gives £5. Thank you very much. And whatever. I can't see any of the other fan funding. Here we go. Got it. Now I can see it all. Got Grimwolf. Bomani Igloos gives $10 and says, new to Jive, Nietzsche led me to question my Catholic morality. Is it possible to continue on my pagan journey without relinquishing respect for Christ or the historical church? Yes, you don't have to disrespect other religions. Don't have time to go into a discussion of Nietzsche or Catholicism in the stream about this paper. I'm afraid it's too much to talk about in the hour. I thank you also ESMD for $50. He just says R1B and nothing else. I guess that means that you have R1B and you're proud of it. And why not? R1B is a proud lineage. Now, I'll probably go over time because there's so much more to talk about, and I must go over it because we've only just discussed this East Scandinavian cluster, and there's so much interesting stuff to talk about. The Lombards, the Goths, the Anglo-Saxons, and the Vikings, and stuff they talk about here. So I'm just going to do as much as I can in the next, I've got 10 minutes left, but I'm just going to go until I finish this, basically. So by looking at IBD sharing, let me get this one. By looking at IBD sharing, the authors show the genetic borders for the corded ware Belbeaker culture. I've already done that, yeah. Goths of the Vielbach culture were East Scandinavian in origin, East Sweden. In contrast, the later cultural descendants, the Ostrogoths and Visigoths in southern Europe, in Ukraine and in Spain, respectively, are predominantly of local Ukrainian and Iberian ancestry, implying the adoption of Gothic culture. So that means that both the old-fashioned Gothicismists, like Swedish sort of chauvinistic 18th century movement, where they say everything came from the Goths, they were right as far as Poland. Like the Goths were from Sweden, and they did move into Poland, and they remained Swedish in Poland. The Goths in Poland were of Swedish origin and were Swedish genetically. But as the Goths continued their journey across Europe and even into Africa, they did not remain Swedish. Such, by the time they got to Spain, they mixed with the Spaniards or the Iberians, and when they went to Ukraine, they mixed with locals. And we already knew that the Ostrogoths mixed with locals, because we got quite a lot from older papers of Ostrogoths clearly taking Asiatic girlfriends, as people do in this form of Huns, on the steppe. So that's interesting. It shows that yes, the Germanic people and the migrations could remain Germanic and resist mixing with outsiders in some circumstances, as they did in Poland, but also in other circumstances they do mix with the locals, as they did in Spain and Ukraine. And that suggests an elite cultural dominance model, where you have an elite that enforces a cultural norm on the wider population without affecting a massive genetic change on the population. And that does happen in certain cases. Like the Normans. The Normans did not leave a significant genetic effect on the British Isles. French DNA is in the British Isles, but not directly from the Norman conquest. Anyway, so from 1700 to 1400 BC, in the Nordic Bronze Age, as I said, the South and East Scandies mixed together in Denmark, they think, somewhere in Denmark, to make a new group called Iron Age South Scandinavians. Now, Iron Age South Scandinavians are really important. It says here, central to understanding the Germanic dispersal. So after you're talking about post-Nordic Bronze Age, we're not talking about the East Scandies anymore. We're talking about a mixed race population. Mixed race, the same race, really, but, like mixed ethnic population of which is now called the Iron Age Southern Scandinavians. And they went everywhere. And the Iron Age Southern Scandinavians, and South Scandinavians can then further be divided into two groups using this IBD sharing cluster method. One focused on Jutland and the other on Mecklenburg in Germany. The replacement of the old East Scandinavian, like Zealand population, the island of Zealand, where that had people on it who were mostly East Scandinavian origin, but they got replaced in the Proto-Germanic period after 600 BC with ancestry from Sweden, Norway, Jutland, and the continent, even with Celtic-like DNA. That happened later. And Jutland in that same period received additional East Scandinavian DNA, but kept kept its local DNA too. So it's Jutland had South Scandinavian Iron Age ancestry, but then also received additional East Scandinavian DNA on top of that, of what it already had in the original Bronze Age mixture during the Iron Age. So it shows there's lots of mixing events that history's never recorded. And archaeology, we can't see it in the archaeology, and it's long before history. And we're seeing like quite turbulent population turnovers within the Germanic world in the prehistoric periods. During the migration period, 1575 to 1200 BP, what a stupid thing. We find evidence of this structured admixed southern Scandinavian population representing the Western Germanic Anglo-Saxon migrations into Britain and Langobards into southern Europe. So what it's found is that while the Gretzinger and al. Paper about Anglo-Saxon DNA from 2022, about which I did a stream, you can watch, it's the really big paper on Anglo-Saxon DNA, it's fascinating, and they reckon the sources for Anglo-Saxons in Britain were from as far away as Sweden. They said that the main regions that the Anglo-Saxons came from were going to be Jutland and Germany, which is what Bede, the Anglo-Saxon sources like Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and Bede, the Venerable Bede say anyway, and that's what everyone's always believed. But they also say, some of them could have come from as far away as Sweden. But this paper says, no, actually, that using their IBD method, they say that Anglo-Saxons were mostly from just North Germany and a minority from Jutland. So just most of them are Saxon and a few Angles and Utes, not Swedes, as the Gretzinger paper kind of hinted might be the case. Which would mean that Bede is 100% accurate. Really interesting, 8th century historians just beat the F out of the 20th century historians. So Langobards, which is a Germanic group, obviously with Nordic origins. The medieval origin myths of the Langobards say they came from Scandinavia. And guess what? They did. the post-Roman historians were right that they found this too. So they're looking at Langobards from Czechia, Hungary, and Italy, modeled as primarily southern Scandinavian Iron Age, consistent with post-classical origin legends. However, 3 outlier Langobards from the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Hungary are of Eastern Scandinavian origin. So that's interesting. So most of them are from this mixed South Scandinavian Iron Age group that I mentioned that formed in the Bronze Age. But some of them, 2 outliers, would have come from Sweden, and one's in the Czech Republic, and 3 outliers, in the Czech Republic and Hungary. But none of these Swedish, so that means the South Scandinavian one's probably going to be from southern Sweden and Denmark, and that's where most Langobards' origins are, except for the few Langobards who have a more clearly East Scandinavian origin, which is interesting. It shows the Langobards had some Nordic diversity. If you want to call it diversity. They came from different parts of Scandinavia. The major population shift in South Scandinavia between the Roman and the Viking periods was not solely driven by the climate events or Justinian plague, but instead likely took hold between 1550 and 1450 BP, which is 500 AD, a migration era, and was associated with the establishment and subsequent expansion of what became the Danes. So they're talking about an ethnogenesis of the Danish group, the Danish people around the 6th century. Fascinating. So these pre-migration, pre-6th century, there was so many tumultuous population turnovers in Jutland and Zealand and the other Danish islands, that they're thinking that the actual Danish ethnic group had an ethnogenesis around the 500s. Amazing if true. South Scandinavian population the South Scandi population in 800 AD, that's the Viking Age, changes with lots of southern ancestry from Germany and Britain entering in the Viking Age, with what they call a virtually complete population replacement on the Danish islands. So first off, you've got the Danish ethnic group forming at the beginning of the migration, at the end of the migration era, and then you're saying in the Viking Age it completely is replaced by southerners coming in of Germanic people from the south, and also the influence on the Viking Age of British DNA as well in Scandinavia. That's fascinating. Because now we're talking about the historical period and we're still finding things out. But we have seen in other previous papers as well, lots of evidence, especially in Norway, of British DNA in Scandinavia, such that Viking Age Scandinavians were more British. Viking Age Scandinavians were less Scandinavian than modern Scandinavians are. The modern day, native Scandinavians are pretty much pure Scandinavian, but the, excluding immigrants, of course, but the Viking Age Scandinavians often had British admixture. And it's now this one's showing also German admixture. So here we got we can now reject the Danish Isles and Sweden as a source area for the Anglo-Saxons in Britain, as they were dominated by Eastern Scandinavia prior to the Viking Age. That's interesting. That's what I was just going over what I said there, what these different quotes say. Admixture between Bronze Age Southern and Eastern Scandinavians likely occurred in Jutland and the Danish Isles during the Nordic Bronze Age, and leading to the formation. I've already said that. Yeah. The Late Bronze Age is the period during which Paleo-Germanic donated. Late Nordic Bronze Age, which is not what most people, other parts of the world, mean by they say Bronze Age, because Nordic Bronze Age is after most regions of the world have a Bronze Age, almost like the Mediterranean Bronze Age is earlier. That's when they donated to Finnish and got vocabulary from Celtic, such as the word for iron comes from Celtic, and the Finnish word for king comes from Germanic, suggesting it was spoken widely among East Scandinavians distributed between Sweden and Denmark in that period, 3,000 years ago. In the Danish islands, the shift amounts to virtually complete population replacement. That's wild. I can't believe that. Complete population replacement in the Danish islands in that period. So In Jutland during the Iron Age, individuals tend to fall within the southern Scandinavian cluster and are modelled with 55% southern and 45% eastern Scandinavian DNA. Further east, individuals are more eastern. On the Danish Isles, their model is 20% southern and 80% eastern. And in Sweden, people are mostly 100% eastern. This graphic is really cool. I just want to talk about this one before we stop. It's showing like the time age of their different groups. You've got the colours showing Roman Iron Age, Migration Period, Late Iron Age and Viking Period. Those are like the historical periods that historians and archaeologists refer to. Here you can show where the Eastern Scandinavians dominate, the grey period of mixture, and then Southern Scandinavian Iron Age is the consequent as a dominant in the Viking era. This timeline shows the genetic shifts in the Danish Isles and southern Sweden, this tumultuous area where so much population change is happening. We didn't even know about, like it's not recorded in legends or anything even. So North Germanic is spoken more in the Roman Iron Age. And then Old North, and it becomes Syncope period, and then Old Norse. Some of the it doesn't say here, but some of the regions, like some Danes don't like that in Jutland, they find like the oldest runic inscriptions in Jutland aren't North Germanic and are not ancestral to Danish language. They're West Germanic. And now this DNA stuff is showing as well, like, and the paper talks about it. I can't go over it all in detail now because I haven't got time now, but the West Germanic was the language of Jutland. And there was a West Germanic dialect there. And there's like later on the Viking Age the North Germanic people come back. There's like North Germanic people were probably dominating it, and then West Germanic dominated it, and then it got taken back by North Germanics, which is why, like, everyone speaks Danish there now, which is North Germanic language. But it certainly would have, at one point, I mean, the runes show that the runic inscriptions, like Bracteate evidence and stuff from parts of, Denmark, Jutland, is demonstrating that West Germanic was spoken there. And now we know that this change from West to Northern Germanic is accompanied by population turnovers. They were brutal times, no doubt about it. The Roman Iron Age has agricultural stability, and then you have this period from the migration era where it's concentration in favorable areas and then reoccupation of agricultural areas in the late Iron Age. So there's tumultuous time. There's a decline in the population size at the late migration period. And this migration period coincides with the arrival of the Odin as the main god religion, like the Germanic religion as we understand it. Odin or Woden can be reliably understood to have been the main god of Germanic people prior to the migration era, prior to the dispersal of like Anglo-Saxons and Goths, because all of them have Odin or Woden or Godin as their main god. So it's not the actual migration era itself that brought Odin, because Odin is already like dominant in all of these places, so it predominates that. And this is also the period when the South Scandinavians adopt this new animal-style art, which is all these twisting, interlocking creatures grasping and biting each other. And it's very influenced by Scythian artwork for some reason, which no one seems really to understand how it happened. But that artwork isn't really there in Nordic Bronze Age times. And Nordic Bronze Age times are the times when Scythians existed. So Scythians and their art, their animal art, didn't really exist at that time, like 400 AD when it starts. Saalin Style 1 begins at that time. But that's when the Germanics start to switch towards it. And partly probably why Greeks and some southern people referred to Germanic people like Goths and even later Vikings as Scythians, because they saw that they wore trousers and had Scythian style art, similar looking kind of people, and thought maybe they were Scythians, but they were not Scythians. They do not have any Scythian DNA. We know that there's no Scythian genetic influence on the Germanic people, but we can definitely see a cultural influence, and the exact way that was mediated is not clear. That would be a very interesting area of research for the future. Then after the migration, it's towards the end of the migration period, you get up here listing like the volcanic eruptions that caused like very, very, very bad winters, the Justinian plague, and the dispersals of Germanic people, which obviously could have been made worse for, like, in terms of if you're a Southern European, there may have been push factors caused by these, but already that stuff is happening before all these disasters. And there's been a massive cultural change in the Germanic world, which resulted in this militant ideology with Odin as the main god, and Germanic people emerging on the world stage. That's when people start to have historical references to them. And that's when people, eventually it results in people referring to Scandinavia as the womb of nations, because it gives birth to the Franks, it gives birth to the Langobards, it gives birth to the Goths, the Anglo-Saxons, it gives birth to so many different races that became like the dominant peoples who founded Europe as we know it. Charlemagne was a Frank. The English, the Langobards in Italy, the Visigoths in Spain, like the whole of Europe is dominated by people who were born from the Scandinavian peninsula. So this idea of a womb of nations has been, which is a medieval expression, I think, is definitely vindicated by modern genetic science. I don't think I can really go over much more. Let me just check your comments. Absolutely no excuse for that haircut, mate, says the Scottish man. Oh, you don't like my hair? Oh, sorry, I didn't realise there was a barber in the audience. You tell me. Just tell me what to do, fam. Indo-Europeans used the A word about themselves? No, they did not. The A word is an Indo-Iranic word, but it may derive from a Proto-Indo-European word, Arios. But that's a contested etymology, and I can't say with any authority whether it's a good one or not. Spurgler Acolyte asks on X, wasn't Stockholm also part of the Hanseatic League with German settlers helping the economy there? Yes, it was. Gotland was a massive part of the Hanseatic League. Gotland is so interesting because like now it's probably quite south shifted, the Gotland population, because it was, so many Germans there. Earlier, it was very, very Nordic and had an extremely high dominance of I1 haplogroups. But if you go into the Bronze Age, you can also see that it was very Baltic, and there were a lot of Lithuanian-like cultural artifacts there. So it's being in the middle of the Baltic has made it a very important strategic place, and it still is today. It very, very strategic. The American troops will be on Gotland very soon. There will be I don't want to talk too much about it, but Russia has its eyes on Gotland. America has its eyes on Gotland. Gotland's position has always made it extremely central for various reasons. Better not go too much into it. Fresh says, I don't really get the Alan Toft conclusions on I1. There's only 9 people, 8 I1 and 1 I1b. Don't get how I1 would have decreased so much in the last 2,000 years. More likely just sampling errors. Well, they also, despite their new samples, they got lots of samples, and not just those ones. Go to this. It's professional looking, not as bad as the Norman bowl cut you had a few weeks ago, says Alistair. This is the same haircut. I just haven't had my haircut since then. It's just grown a bit, that's all. It was a bad haircut, and I'm just growing it out so I can get it cut properly. That's why it doesn't look great. I wanted a bowl cut. I did actually ask for a bowl cut, but it was bad about bowl cut. I might keep the bowl cut for a while. I'm not sure yet. What about Odin being based on Attila the Hun? That's nonsense. Absolutely no way. Because the influence of Attila on the Germanic world post-dates the proliferation of the Odin cult, so it's not possible. Arrogant Invictus says, Germanics do have Scythian DNA. I heard it in a blood memory sleepwalk session. It's hard to... I didn't know about that. I didn't check those sources of blood memory sleepwalking. There's a lot of zoomorphic Latine Celtic artwork that are more likely root, says Peter Houlihan. I disagree. Latine Celtic artwork is not the source of Salin style 1 that I can see, because Latine I've not even, maybe if you're right, I might not have seen the relevant sources that you're talking about, but Latine style artwork is generally not zoomorphic. It's very much vine work, and it comes, and whereas the Germanic, I've done a whole video on the origin of Celtic knotwork coming out of Germanic knotwork. So actually, most of what we call Celtic knotwork is derivative of Germanic knotwork, and Germanic knotwork, it might have some Latine influences, but not very clearly. It's not obviously based on Latine, and it emerges a long time after Latine stopped being used in the Celtic world. So it's like, this is after it comes about as the Roman Empire the Western Roman Empire is crumbling. That's the moment when the Germanic people switch to this style, and its epicenter is not in the continent; it's in Scandinavia. So I don't know to me, it seems more likely that the vector is a Turkic people that they were trading with, some Turkic people who would have Scythian roots, perhaps, and I'm not aware of their artistic traditions, maybe, and that's why I'm not able to say. Or it could be a Baltic people, because I understand Baltic people do have influences from Iranic artwork as well. But I don't know. It's something archaeologists should look at, because this Salin style art is definitely a big break from previous Germanic art, and it's something. It ties in with the beginning of the whole Odin cult and all these tumultuous changes genetically within Scandinavia. So something big's happening then. It's very interesting. So okay, I'll just check. What else have we got? Any more? $5 from Dylan Schvarding. Pray to Jesus from Druidic powers. The tradition only... well, that's just silly. It's some silliness from someone. But yeah, thanks for $5 for Druidic powered Jesus. Rambling nonsense. Well, my friends, me old chums, thank you for watching Jive Talk. And I hope you found this interesting and a good summary of the paper. And I'll continue to elucidate findings from papers as much as I can here on Jive Talk. And I'm soon going to be launching for those of you who are actually interested in Germanic paganism, or heathenry as it's called, I will soon be launching a distance learning online course which will teach you exactly how to get started with practicing heathenry at home or communally, and the course will be called Starting Heathenry. So watch this space if you want to learn exactly how to do it. Also, make sure you subscribe to this channel, Jive Talk, on YouTube if you want to make sure you see all my other streams, or to the main channel, Survive the Jive, if you want to see my normal edited videos. Thanks a lot for everyone. Also, to those who are listening later on podcast, thank you very much also. Goodbye, everyone, and thanks again.